Welcome back to the Lou Perez podcast. My name is Lou Perez. If you want to support the show, please head over to thelouperez.locals.com and join the Lou Perez community on locals.com. And be sure to follow me on all social media at the Lou Perez. Here we go. And I'm very happy to be joined by Phil Magness. And Phil, can you tell us a little bit about yourself for those who might not be familiar with you?
Yeah, thanks again for having me. I am an economic historian, and I'm based at the American Institute for Economic Research, a very multifaceted area of expertise that mostly focuses on economic history. Look at the 19th century, slavery, elements of the history of economic thought, also as they interact with that. But I also extend into data analysis all the way up into the present day.
Cool. And I guess, maybe 100 years from now, people might be talking about how I live in New York City, and I just found out that Zoom, which is the program that we're using to talk with one another, there's going to be something like a 2.3% tax put on Zoom products that I have to pay just because I'm attempting to communicate from my humble abode in Brooklyn. So it's like, ooh, just putting the squeeze on me right there.
Right.
So, and where are you located, Phil?
It's at Great Barrington, Massachusetts.
I guess over the past few months, you've sort of leapfrogged or gone from sort of academia, research, history into, I guess, like online feuds. And I'm not, look, we all have to take responsibility for our actions. I don't know how much of that is you, or how much of it is the people you happen to disagree with. But maybe we could start by talking a little bit about the 1619 project and how that sort of, how that came about. So.
Yeah, and it's kind of been interesting because, with the lockdowns and everything that came in the wake of the coronavirus, most of this discussion that would probably take place at academic conferences or take place in public events and venues has been thrust into exactly what we're doing now. It's Zoom meetings or Twitter feuds, Twitter debates. And what we've seen over the past 7 months is really the discussion over the 1619 project, which was awarded a Pulitzer Prize right at the outset of the pandemic, has almost entirely taken place now online. So I entered that over a year ago when the original 1619 project issue came out of the New York Times as a critic, but a measured critic. I'd even go far as to say I was more charitable to it than many of the opponents of the project, but nonetheless pointed out historical errors in the main areas that I worked on and have published on as a scholar, and that is the economics of slavery. So I wrote several successive critiques of the main essay on the economics of slavery, which was written by Matthew Desmond, a sociologist, and then also some critiques, but also partial defenses of claims made in the lead essay to the project, and that was by Nikole Hannah-Jones, who was also the reporter that basically took the charge of creating the 1619 project. That played out for a couple months of back and forth. It became clear by the end of last year that historians were from across the political spectrum were reading this thing, and they were clearly finding problems with both its factual analysis and its interpretation of the past. In particular, it had advanced a kind of a fringe theory of the American Revolution that asserted it was to protect and defend slavery against the British Empire, which I think is utter nonsense, but based on a misreading and an overstatement of evidence. Then the second thing, which I really focused on, was its assertion that capitalism, free market capitalism today, is some sort of a derivative of the slave plantation system of the 19th century, which is a really aggressively argued view on the far left side of academia and the political spectrum, but it's something that economic historians have largely rejected. And yet the 1619 project's primarily based on that.
So on the first charge that the Revolutionary War was fought to protect slavery. When did England get rid of slavery? Well, when did they do away with it?
Right. It's not for another 50 years after the American Revolution.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an absurdity that's at odds with the timeline itself to assert that England is an emerging kind of abolitionist power in 1775, 1776.
Hmm.
Because what's really going on in Great Britain is there is an internal debate over slavery. So there are abolitionists in England proper, just as there are abolitionists in the United States. But it's not abolitionist England versus pro-slavery United States at all in that time.
Yeah, and I wonder if so much of that has to do with I think it almost seems like the way that slavery is taught in the United States. You It seems like students can walk away thinking that slavery is almost an American invention,
Right.
that it wasn't happening forever, and also in other parts of the world.
Yeah, it's treated, especially in the 1619 project, it's treated as almost if it's America's original sin. And there was even some controversy over that. They picked 1619. It's the date that the first slave ship arrives off the coast of Jamestown, Virginia, the English colony. But slavery had already been imported into North America almost a century prior by the Spanish colonies. And Spain, at this time controlled what's now the state of Florida. Spain had vast presences on both the North American continent and South American continent that were connected to slavery. So it's not like a uniquely American historical event, although the emphasis does tend to play it up as if it's the United States' original sin, whereas everywhere else is kind of either politely overlooked or shoved aside.
I have ancestors going back to Spain, and it is interesting to see sort of the history of Spain sort of just kind of gets, we just kind of leap over that and just go directly
Right.
to the English, and for the the hundreds of years that Spain was conquering. They were conquistadors,
Exactly.
that they were having their way in the New World. I tweeted something out a while. I said, for anyone who's still speaking the language of the conquistadors, meaning Spanish, you are complicit. And a bunch of people took me seriously, and they're like, but that's my language. That's what I grew up with. How you expect me to speak a native language that was taken away?
Yeah.
So, you wrote a really interesting piece, in particular, about the intersection of capitalism and the abolitionist movement,
Right.
where I forget the website that you published it on, but you really took to task this idea that capitalism was keeping up slavery, as
Yeah.
opposed to
Yeah.
being completely opposed to it.
Right, right. So it's a question of the intellectual history of capitalism, which is almost entirely missing from this narrative. As a historian of economic thought, this is something I've studied for decades and is very near and dear to me. But you can go all the way back to Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, which is published in 1776. It's generally considered like the first full, true treatise of economics that argues from kind of this free market capitalist perspective. Of course, they didn't use the name capitalism back then. That's a little bit of a later invention. But the way that Smith is contextualized in that part of the history, he's kind of the founding figure of capitalism and that whole intellectual lineage of free market thought up into the present day, which is interesting because Adam Smith is also an abolitionist. And in The Wealth of Nations, he attacks slavery. In several of his other works and lectures, he attacks slavery. This is a major theme of his entire academic career, is denouncing this horrendous institution that he sees taking place across the seas in the colonies, but he sees it as both economically destructive and morally destructive. So he is certainly not someone that would be associating his economic system with the slave class. So there's an immediate complication. That should be the red flag of something like the 1619 Project, is claiming that capitalism and slavery are friends, and yet the preeminent kind of founding theorist of free market capitalist thought is an abolitionist. Something's not adding up right there. Adam Smith has many intellectual and political errors in the early 19th century that really take up the mantle of what we'd call free market capitalist thought. Foremost among them in Great Britain is Richard Cobden, who it leads the charge in Parliament to abolish protective tariffs, and is just a major figure in elevating what we call the laissez-faire school of thought into prominence on economic matters. But it turns out Cobden himself is also an abolitionist, and campaigns against the Southern Confederacy during the American Civil War. He's over in Britain trying to discourage people in Britain from supporting the Confederacy and saying, the Union cause is the one that we should back. So it just doesn't add up when you start looking at all these figures in what we'd call the capitalist tradition. It gets even more complicated because on the pro-slavery side, you have figures that are defending slavery from the Southern perspective. Foremost among them is a guy by the name of George Fitzhugh. He's a very popular pamphleteer in the 1850s. Is seen as kind of like the foil, the William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, the abolitionists in the North. This is their pro-slavery adversary in the South. So George Fitzhugh, this radical pro-slavery theorist, denounces capitalism. He writes a pamphlet in the early 1850s where he says that we should take the theories of Adam Smith, of his successors, and cast them into the fire. And his reason was he thought that free market capitalism, by promoting free labor, would undermine the slave system. He said that free market ideology, laissez-faire theory, is at war with slavery. So not only do you have abolitionists aligning on the free market side, you have slave owners and slave theorists aligning on the anti-capitalist side in the 19th century. This is the complete opposite of the story that these writers in the 1619 Project are claiming.
How do they contend with that? What's their response?
So the fascinating thing from the 1619 Project, the people that are making this case about slavery and capitalism being tainted and partners together have adopted a position of non-engagement with critics, with anyone that raises these problems with their thesis. And I'd say they're fundamental problems that debunk the thesis. But they refuse to engage the evidence. One of the leading figures is a historian at Cornell by the name of Ed Baptist. And 4 or 5 years ago, he was coming under fire on very similar types of criticism for his book that made this argument. And he just decided that he was no longer going to engage his critics, accused a bunch of them of being racist for opposing this argument that he was advancing. And we've seen that play through all the way into the spillover in the 1619 Project. So this essay by Matthew Desmond, the one that I critique, almost every major historian and economist critic of the 1619 Project has pointed out this essay as one of the major flaws of it. And yet the New York Times won't even acknowledge that there's pushback, that there's criticism.
Is this just abnormal? Like, what is it like? What was it like? Say 10 years ago, working in this field and having these kinds of debates. Because I wonder, it seems almost like the responses that you describe, and in particular the responses to you directly, they have a tinge of sort of the social media culture that we're under, where it's sort of like, oh, Phil has a stupid haircut, therefore I don't have to listen to what he has to say. And I'm not saying you have a stupid haircut. I think you have a good haircut. Just using it as an example, but sort of like these ad hominem attacks where it's almost like, well, I have a blue check mark on Twitter, therefore I don't have to engage you, and I don't have to engage your arguments. And as somebody, as a civilian, as somebody who looks to historians like yourself and looks to the New York Times for my information, it's pretty disconcerting.
Yeah. And it very much is a blue checkmark phenomenon. Really early in the 1619 Project debate, I had an encounter on Twitter with a historian that was very much in favor of the project. And I pointed out some of the factual flaws to her, and she responded by using like grade school "your mama" insults in response to me. And there's actually a little bit of a news story. And then some other people jumped on the thread that were actual scholars, and she starts insulting them, just flinging profanities, flinging insults at people that dared to question her political interpretation. And something I pointed out at the time was, say 10 years ago, 15 years ago, before this culture really existed online, suppose, envision a top historian at Harvard or Princeton or something like that, speaking at an academic conference and being challenged by questions in the audience or someone else on the panel, and responding by telling "your mama" insults or shouting profanities, which is what they normally do on these Twitter threads. That person would probably be asked to leave the conference for engaging in just blatantly unprofessional conduct. especially abusive conduct towards their interlocutors and critics. But yet, that's what we've seen as the norm from the defenders of the 1619 Project all the way up to Nikole Hannah-Jones herself. If you look at her Twitter feed, although she just recently deleted the entire thing to hide some of the controversy in it, it is a nonstop barrage of personal insults, abuse, scorn, like insulting memes, just derogatory behavior toward anyone and everyone that criticizes and attempts to substantively engage in the facts and issues that the 1619 Project airs on.
Yeah, just for clarity's sake, the people saying like the equivalent of like "yo mama" jokes. Is your mother a economic historian as well?
No, she is not.
Ah, you see, almost.
I'm retired school teacher.
That would make so much more sense. On the on the issue of Nikole Hannah-Jones, I remember one one thing, the one tweet that stood out for me. I guess she was responding to her critics, sort of as a group, and it was a picture of her displaying her grill on like
Right.
on her teeth, and that just seemed very weird to
Yeah.
me that somebody who is a Pulitzer Prize winner. I don't know if she was at the time. I don't know if
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
had been awarded yet. Would respond to critics in such a fashion.
Let's say, not even if she's necessarily a Pulitzer Prize winner yet. I mean, this is a top journalist at the supposed paper of record in the United States. And I remember that exact exchange. The person that she flashed her grill at and posted all these derogatory comments about was an African American critic of the 1619 Project.
Hmm.
So she's just engaged in very unprofessional, scornful, abusive behavior at critics from across the spectrum. Another example that came up is when James McPherson and Gordon Wood, Sean Wilentz, these are prominent historians at Ivy League institutions. Most of them, I'd say, are politically on the center left. Started to point out some of the problems with the 1619 Project on factual basis. Tried to substantively and very professionally engage the editors at the Times to get them to issue necessary corrections or respond at least. And she tweeted out that these are just a bunch of quote white historians, as if that was a sufficient answer to their criticisms. But this has been across the board. My own engagement with her, she here's the irony of it. She came under fire early on, not only just for the American Revolution, but for some of her interpretation of the Abraham Lincoln presidency. And one of the issues was over Lincoln's plan to colonize freed slaves in the Caribbean and other locales, which is a historically true, accurate event. It did happen, and Lincoln certainly believed in it. In fact, much of my scholarship is in that exact issue, that exact area, and I discovered all sorts of evidence that teased out what happened in this program and why it ultimately failed during the Civil War. So she came under criticism from some historians on the other side of that thought she overstated the evidence, and she started citing my book in her own defense, citing my evidence and research in her own defense, and sent out several tweets and public comments with links back to my book on Amazon.
Wow.
A couple of days later, she realizes that I was the author of the same book she was citing, and suddenly I was persona non grata. So she abandoned that entirely and then started attacking my credentials, starting to say, well, because he's an economic historian, his background is in a policy school. He studies economics, not just straight up history. Magness is therefore unqualified to criticize my essay and criticize historical events. And this is even though I've published probably I think I counted up over 24 scholarly works in the Civil War era and the economics of the 19th century, slavery, all the material that's exactly topical to the 1619 Project.
And anyone who's been following this, I mean, it does look like Jones has had sort of like a little bit of a public meltdown,
Mhm.
in that you describe her erasing a number of tweets, but I think one of the latest things was you had pointed out that the language on the New York Times website, the digital version of the 1619 Project, language had been scrubbed
Yes.
without
Yeah.
without anyone saying, "Hey, we're taking out this language." Well, what was that specific language?
Well, this is so if you go all the way back to August of last year when it was published, one of the opening paragraphs. This was on their flashy website copy of it. So the thing that in the digital age, this is where most readers encounter print media. They don't carry around the paper copy of the newspaper anymore. They read it on the website. And the lead paragraph, the intro to the website copy, said that the year 1619 was the true founding, quote unquote, true founding of the United States of America, not 1776. So this was a big political themed framing of the entire project. And it's a theme that Nikole Hannah-Jones took and ran with. So her Twitter feed had a banner on it that showed the year 1776 crossed out and replaced by 1619. But it's also something the critics seized on very early on and said, this is almost an inflammatory way of framing American history that denigrates some of the positive events that we celebrate, like 1776, and attempts to force everything into this narrative that is nothing but slavery centric to the denigration of anything and everything else. So it was something that got a lot of backlash. There were several newspaper columns written about this one specific line, that the true founding was 1619, not 1776. Well, that abrasiveness of the claim ended up being a cause for controversy when the paper was going into Pulitzer Prize season. It's something that really didn't set easily with the people that were considering this for major journalism awards, and they eventually give it to them. But what we find is that sometime over the last year, Nikole Hannah-Jones and the other writers at the New York Times involved in this project just very quietly stopped using that language. They dropped the true founding of 1619 versus 1776. They quit trying to juxtapose the two side by side as if one should be reframed and used to displace the other. It just drops out of their rhetoric right in advance of the Pulitzer Prize season. It went mostly unnoticed at the time because it's just something that they quit talking about. But about a month ago, so this is September 2020, when the 1619 project came under fire from Donald Trump and some Republicans in Congress started critiquing it, Nikole Hannah-Jones goes on CNN and gives an interview. And she was asked specifically about this date thing, this reframing of 1619 versus 1776. And her response is effectively, I never said that. I never made that claim. So, those of us that have been following this for the last year are just kind of flabbergasted by this. There was a writer for the Atlantic, Connor Friedersdorf, posted a thread that documented like 10 different instances of her making the claim that she was now denying. So several people took notice of this. What came along for me is, so I'm reading this controversy that's unfolded over her now denying what was once the center point claim of the project. And I remember distinctly reading that in the text of the project on the web copy. So about a month ago, I went back to the website where this thing was hosted, and lo and behold, the line is gone. It's been disappeared. It was sent down the memory hole, edited out at some point over the previous several months. And I did a little more digging, and some other sleuths in the social media sphere started comparing archived copies of the web page, and we pinpointed it down. It seems to have disappeared sometime around last December or January, right in advance of the Pulitzer Prize season. So I wrote an article basically calling attention to this because it's no longer like an interpretive or factual dispute. This is a case of journalistic ethics. And the paper of record, the New York Times, surreptitiously deleting lines that it previously published in its web form and in its print copy that no longer are there in the project. And, internet sleuths start looking at other parts of it, and there were like 2 or 3 other instances found where they did similar things. They edited out lines that had drawn controversy around the 1619 project and then started pretending as if they were never there at all. So that burst into the open. That's what caused Bret Stephens, a columnist for the Times. He covered this in a critique of Nikole Hannah-Jones, and it basically kind of ignited a civil war inside the New York Times' newsroom, from all accounts, of the people that are trying to defend journalistic ethics and saying, this is wrong. And then you have a younger generation of what could probably be called like the wokester journalists that don't care about fidelity to evidence, don't care about fidelity to the printed word. They view this as like a political battle of upholding Nikole Hannah-Jones and the 1619 Project at all cost.
And how, it's like without those important words like the true founding, it's almost like, how can you even call the project the 1619 Project as opposed to something else? I'm trying to think the equivalent of like if a band has a concept album and you get rid of the main like the main song from the album, but yet the album's still called. I don't know. I'm trying to. I'm probably doing way too much work to make sense of it. But I think what's really troubling about this, and them trying to scrub it and hoping that nobody would notice, is, man, you really you take away a lot of the authority of the voices that contributed to it. And like you said that there was writings in the 1619 Project that you agree with and that people should know about, and to just do this, it's just a huge disservice.
Well, there's the great tragedy of it all. The 1619 Project as a journalistic endeavor, I think, was conceptually merited in the sense of, I get what they were trying to do. They're trying to draw attention to the neglected nuances and details of slavery, both historically and its legacy in the present day, which is, a perfectly worthwhile project and concept. And most of the essays for the 1619 Project are perfectly fine at that mission. What's happened, though, in the last year is the way that the New York Times has handled the fallout from the controversy. Well, first off, they overreached in two or three of the main essays, and that's Matthew Desmond and Nikole Hannah-Jones, the ones that have really gotten the focus of attention. They basically used this historical analysis to argue a 2020 political message that sounds a lot more like the Green New Deal and socialized medicine and tax hikes than it does a historical analysis of slavery.
Yeah.
So,
and there's also sort of the poetry of it as well.
Yeah.
I think one of the lines is about um, the very DNA of the country is has been described as having this, and which I think from an artistic perspective, like that sounds beautiful, but then it's like, well, wait a minute, what does that mean? What does that actually tell us about our shared history and where we are today?
Yeah. So it's DNA rooted in this origin point, and 1619 is the preeminent way that this is branded, whether it's literal or metaphorical. That was there. That was the brand. And now it became controversial. They're just sending it away, sending it down the memory hole and pretending it never existed. That's a problem. And the real tragedy of this is, aside from what it's revealed about the New York Times' lack of journalistic standards, it's also cast a shadow over the 7 or 8 other essays that were not political, that were not part of this try to rebrand and manipulate the project after it's published. So unfortunately, I think through the Times' own handling of the controversy, they've discredited other essays unfairly. They've discredited the bulk of their whole product by latching it on to just this almost incorrigible defense of material that probably should never have been printed in just 1 or 2 of the essays, and that certainly warranted a correction or retraction or deeper scrutiny than the Times was willing to give it.
Do you think there's a chance that the Pulitzer will be taken away, or do you think it's sort of not in 2020, not this year?
Right. I think in a just world, in a world that was concerned with evidence and facts and journalistic ethics, the changing of the text combined with the Times' refusal to properly engage substantive criticism of that essay would merit, on its surface, the retraction of the Pulitzer Prize. I mean, this is akin to a journalistic or an academic scandal at this point. Unfortunately, we live in a very politicized world, so I've been surprised before, but I am not holding out high optimism that the committee will do the right thing.
How did you get into all of this? Like, how did you decide that you wanted your vocation to be economic historian? What drew you to this subject, and in particular the time periods that you cover?
Yeah, so I've some of my earliest academic work was specifically on the politics and the economics of slavery. I've always found it an interesting subject, precisely because it is so tragic, precisely because it was such a horrendous political fight to get rid of this institution. So I grew up reading texts about the Civil War, texts about the abolitionists, some of the arguments that they were making, and then connecting them to some of the economic themes, because I see the same stuff in Adam Smith. I see the same stuff in people like Richard Cobden that are writing on the economic dimensions. They're also anti-slavery figures. So bringing all that together just kind of excited me about the subject in ways that made me want to investigate it as a historian and as someone who works on the economic side of that history, and come up with a theory, come up with a better understanding of why slavery played out the way it did, why it was so difficult to get rid of politically, and what are some of the harmful legacies that it's had. So when the 1619 Project launches, and it's ostensibly about investigating this history of slavery, I'm sitting here reading it as someone who's been working in this for 15, 20 years. Has dozens of published works on it. It was right in my subject area. So yeah, of course I'm going to jump in and comment on it. But then when you start reading it and you start seeing just how not misguided, but also just atrociously wrong some of the claims that it's being put forth as facts in it are, it becomes a necessary task, an almost incumbent task for scholars that work in this area to try to set the record straight, to try to give it responsible criticism that, for various reasons, the Times has avoided.
Yeah, and what do you think from your own scholarship? What are some of uh, the most interesting things that you've come about, or that you've discovered about slavery in the United States, like stuff that we might not be learning in elementary school or.
So the one thing that we all hear about is that there is a pushback against slavery on the eve of the Civil War, and it's associated with the ascendancy of Abraham Lincoln, with his election to the presidency. We all know that basic story, the Emancipation Proclamation, and then some of the political processes that they go through to eventually abolish the institution. One thing that I focused on in my own work that I think is often left out of that story is just how intermeshed the slave system is with what I'd call like political capture of the government, interest group capture of the government. So, we think of interest groups today. What do? They bribe politicians to get favorable bills or get subsidies for the corn industry or the steel industry or whatever happens to be politically connected in Washington. Well, if you start thinking of slave owners the very same way, start thinking of them as an interest group that lobbies Congress for favors from the federal government, lobbies their state governments for favors that prop up slavery, it adds a whole new dimension of the political story of this institution. This is something that Adam Smith pointed out in 1776. He says basically that wherever slavery exists in the world, I've noticed this tendency of the slave owners themselves to run for political office. They get themselves elected to the legislatures or the colonial assemblies, and once they're there, they will never do anything that votes against the interest of this institution. Quite the opposite. We see this in the decades before the Civil War. Southern political interests that are wrapped up in the slave system are voting through measures such as the Federal Fugitive Slave Act, which both funds the enforcement of the return of escaped slaves to the South, and then attempts to oblige the northern states to participate in this, basically the scheme of the slave catchers. There are other federal, state, and local expenditures on funding slave patrols, funding a policing mechanism that's all designed to keep the system propped up and in place. And really what you see on the eve of the Civil War, one of the great grievances against Lincoln is not that he's going to abolish slavery. He had actually stayed clear of making that commitment, and he's kind of a moderate on the issue of abolition outright. But they do see Lincoln as a threat to this continued subsidy, a threat to the federal government continuing to bestow favors on the slave-owning political interest class. So you bring that into the story, it starts becoming less a case of strictly a moral tale. It's also a political and economic tale that's playing out just as corrupt interest group politics would occur today. Of course, there are a lot of people that don't really want to focus or study that kind of a thing because when you start recognizing it, it looks like a case of government failure. It looks like a case of markets that have been badly distorted in slavery's favor by public subsidies, public expenses, things that the federal government is doing to prop up the system. And, that really runs against the whole notion that slavery and laissez-faire capitalism are connected. Quite the opposite. It's a classic case of a sector or industry's capture of government and using it to do crony regulations and benefits and subsidies and expenditures that it otherwise would not have.
And I remember reading about how um, a very small population in the United States and in the South in particular actually owned slaves. Like, what percentage of Southerners were actually slave owners?
Yeah, so I don't have the exact statistics before me. It is absolutely a minority, although there's some complications there because, how do you count the census?
Right.
Do you count slave ownership by households? Do you count slave ownerships by individuals? Another way of putting that, there are sons and daughters and cousins and family members of people that own slaves that are clearly benefiting from slavery, even if they don't own slaves themselves. But it is a minority faction, and it's especially concentrated around the wealthy elite, large plantation owners. And a lot of those tend to be on the eastern coast. Those are the old
The
money.
the East Coast elites,
Exactly. It's the coastal elites.
coastal elites always.
It's the rich people with tens of thousands of acres and several hundred slaves working on the property. Uh, that tends to dominate the political class. And there's actually some resistance prior to the Civil War among Southern poor farmers, the small single plot of land
I was just
individual
about to
farm.
ask you. Yeah, I was just about to ask you that. It's sort of like, how do these elite slave owners sell to the public
Yeah.
the institution of slavery and maintaining it? Where obviously, if you're a poor farmer, you're in competition with these
Right.
big business, if you will, slave
Yeah.
business.
Yeah, so there's a lot of propaganda at the time, the pro-slavery propaganda that's tried to push on the small farmers, on the southern poor people, and really in the whole country, is the idea that if we don't have slavery, we're going to lose our social order, and the slaves will revolt, and there will be mass death, and it's really appealing to fear
Hmm.
in a really ugly, racist way that really dominates the political discussion coming out of the elite. And what we do see is both just prior to the Civil War, there is some unrest, there is some dissent among poor white Southerners that view this institution as something that's holding back the region, as something that's causing all sorts of social and political harms, in addition to being horrendously immoral. And what happens on the eve of the Civil War is you start to see some of these divisions emerge. So when the South, the Deep South, secedes, it's the heavy slave owner states along the Gulf Coast and then the southern eastern coast of the United States that are the initial seceders. But the further inland you go, the further west you go, there's actually more and more dissent among poor white farmers against joining the Confederacy. So there are pockets of rebellion within the Confederacy itself. Especially in the Appalachian regions of Tennessee. The state of West Virginia was originally part of the state of Virginia, but it breaks away during the Civil War, basically because it's the poorer region of the state. It was mostly small farmers that did not own slaves themselves, or if they did, it was a much smaller part of their economy. And in the middle of the Civil War, West Virginia is formed as a new state as a breakaway from the rich elites of the Confederacy in the eastern part of the state. So there's definitely this type of pocket of resistance. This is also the reason why Missouri and Kentucky never really joined the Confederacy. What they have is internal conflicts between the pro-slavery and anti-slavery sides. But this is a huge dimension of the Civil War's strategic lines that often gets shoved aside in the simplistic 30,000 foot picture that we get of it in even like K through 12 textbooks
Yeah.
or popular discussions.
Recently, over the past couple of years, there was some controversy over HBO
Hmm.
They were going to make a series called, I think it was either Confederate or Confederacy or something like that.
Yeah.
And it being sort of an alternate universe where the Confederacy won the Civil War, and you know the slavery has continued all the way up through modern times. And
Right.
I
Right.
guess it was there was some what I thought was some silly controversy, the idea that somehow that a show made by HBO would promote slavery. I think was just sort of ridiculous. But I
Right.
was really looking forward to the show because it is such a complicated subject, and it has such a rich history, and we're still trying to get a handle on what happened and why it happened and all that, where I thought it would be a perfect challenge for writers and performers to tell an interesting new story. But I don't think I don't think we're ever going to get to it.
Right, right. It's become so politicized, the discussion of slavery, that what's lost in the process is nuance. What's
Mhm.
lost is the necessary investigation that we need to look into to find out that this is not just like a two-sided issue. It's an issue that has it transcends the political spectrum. It has parties on both radical abolitionist, radical pro-slavery side, and then almost everything in between, and that needs to be part of the discussion. That needs to be part of our understanding of it, because what happens is, if you take the approach of whether you wanted to use like one of these neo-Confederate stories on the other end fringe, or you use a story like the 1619 Project is telling, both of them are proclaiming that only one of those sides is true. So the 1619 Project, in a weird way, almost adopts the constitutional theory and the economic theories that were being propagated by the Confederates on the eve of the Civil War or in the late 1850s. So 1619 Project's understanding of the U.S. Constitution is almost identical to the Dred Scott decision, in the sense that it accepts the Constitution as a pro-slavery document. But the problem here is, you go back to ask anyone in 1857, the Dred Scott decision is one of the most controversial Supreme Court decisions in the history of the country. Even more so than something like Roe versus Wade today. It would be akin to making an argument that just because the pro-slavery side won the Supreme Court case, that established constitutional perpetuity behind the institution of slavery. Yet any abolitionist in 1857 would be, up in arms, raising the pitchforks at that very notion. They declared the Supreme Court erred. It used the wrong interpretation.
Activist judges, I guess
Exactly,
would be.
exactly. Yeah,
And and
this
and
was
and
Roger
and,
B. Taney, is an activist judge in 1857.
Dred Scott, was that the one where escaped slaves would be returned to the
Yes,
South?
yes. So
Okay.
Dred Scott, he's an escape. He's actually brought out of the slave owning parts of the country by his owner, and essentially sues for freedom, because
Hmm.
you're in the free part of the country, and slavery's laws do not extend there. The idea is, you can have you can order release from your captivity. So this is an old abolitionist legal strategy that goes all the way back to the 1770s in England, and had been used with a great amount of success in most of the northern states for decades. But the Supreme Court basically says, well, Dred Scott, he's black. Because of this, he doesn't have standing to sue. He's not a citizen. He's not contemplated in the American constitutional order. So it really shoves through this radical pro-slavery interpretation of the Constitution. And anyone on the anti-slavery side is rightly saying in 1857, this is an abomination. This is bad law. And that's true of Abraham Lincoln. It's true of Frederick Douglass. It's true of everyone from the most moderate Northerner who's maybe slightly anti-slavery, all the way up to the radical abolitionists, are incensed at this decision. And their whole idea is that we need to push back at this. We need to right our constitutional interpretation from this erroneous decision. And that's completely missing from something like the 1619 Project's legal history.
Wow. I just want to turn things over to another subject,
Yeah.
not related to the 1619 Project or slavery, but it is related in that it's a subject that I think, at least the way that I've seen it discussed, is lacking nuance, and it's also a subject that has gotten you into more trouble,
Yeah.
and that's the great Barrington Declaration.
Right. Right.
Did you say you're living in
In
Great
Great Barrington,
Barrington?
yes, yes.
Okay. Okay. So were you the author of this
I
of this
was
thing?
not the author. I attended the ceremony where they signed it and watched the conference, more so as an observer. I'm an economist in background, economic historian in background. Although I've worked on statistical measures, so I've turned a lot of my attention to COVID as everyone else has since all of these events started to unfold.
Mhm.
But the genesis of the document is we had three top medical scholars, epidemiologists, public health scholars that work in this area. I mean, these are guys with tens of thousands of citations in their work, teaching at Stanford, Oxford, and Harvard University. They came together just for a small conference to have a discussion to alternative views of the lockdowns, alternative strategies to combat the coronavirus besides locking all of society down, and really call attention to some of the social and economic harms that had come in place after the lockdowns that have been neglected from the public discussion. Well, over the course of the weekend, they drafted a short 500 word statement of principles. It's not meant to be like a plan to adopt. It's meant to be a framework for changing the discussion, for having another discussion of what we can do besides lockdowns to address COVID. And they end up signing the document. We released it the following day when they went down to Washington D.C. and met with several officials in the Health and Human Services Department, people on the coronavirus task force, just to plead this alternative case of something that's been shoved aside. And it blew up into kind of going viral. I think the public had been waiting for this type of a case to be made, and several medical professionals have been almost aghast at the fact that the scientific discussion had sidetracked almost entirely in favor of lockdowns and was not giving a proper airing to viewpoints that challenged that. So it goes viral over the course of the next week. And next thing you know, this petition we were expecting maybe to have a couple hundred signatures, maybe a couple thousand from the general public. It blew up. And I think of the latest count, we are somewhere in the neighborhood of 600,000 signers. Of those, maybe about 25,000 are either public health, epidemiology professionals or medical doctors.
And you guys had you had an issue with I guess critics signing the declaration and using I don't know, they're using pseudonyms or that sort of thing. What's going on with that?
Well,
Because but just I just want everyone to know I read over the Great Barrington Declaration, and I went ahead and I signed it.
yeah,
So
no, I appreciate it.
I guess I'm a little I'm a little biased, but yeah, when I heard about people pretending to
Yeah.
be people they're not, that was a little weird.
Yeah, this testifies to the immaturity of the other side of the debate. We were expecting scientific engagement. These are top scholars that are well published in their field. You'd think that scientists and journalists on the other side would want to engage them on the merits of the argument. And I'm okay if people want to disagree with that argument, but take it at its face value and engage the evidence. Let's have the scientific discussion. That's not what happened. Rather, we discovered, a couple of days after the petition went live, and it's gotten wild success. It's all over the media. We have tens of thousands of signatures coming in. There was and I hesitate to even use the term journalist, but there's this character over in Great Britain that's written for things like The Guardian by the name of Nafiz Ahmed. And what he did is he launched a Twitter campaign a couple days after the petition line, basically encouraging critics to submit fake signatures. And they're everything from the one that got quoted as someone submitted Dr. Johnny Bananas. I think there were a couple fake Anthony Fauci's that signed it. But also just a flood of profanities, vulgarities, just Twitter troll stuff. And it's not coming from the random internet weirdo. These are people with blue check marks that are supposed to be epidemiologists or science journalists. Well, I do a little digging. At first, it turns out that this Nafiz Ahmed guy is a fairly notorious character. He was actually a 9/11 truther, conspiracy theorist. 15 years ago, one of those guys that was writing about how jet fuel doesn't heat up enough to melt the steel beams of the Twin Tower.
Well, it's funny. It's funny you bring that up because I was immediately thinking about how The one argument I always hear from 9/11 truthers is that there's been signatures from tens of thousands of
Right.
scientists saying that exactly like yeah, jet fuel doesn't melt steel. But the caveat to that is like it doesn't melt steel, but it weakens it
Right. Right.
considerably,
Exactly.
which makes it very hard for a building to
To stand
stay
during.
up.
Yeah,
Wow.
exactly. So it's almost an exercise in projection. These guys are Twitter trolls that are using troll tactics to try and discredit legitimate scientific discussion. Well, what we did is we actually audited all the numbers, and we discovered there was a clear, pronounced pattern. So I think we found in total of about 1,000 fake signatures up until that point. This is 1,000 out of tens of thousands sightings. So it's a tiny little percentage, but almost half of those came within 24 hours of this guy launching, this Mr. Blue Checkmark launching his campaign to flood the petition with hoax signatures. So it was like this weird media created story. And then what does he do? He turns around and he writes an article about the hoax that he perpetrated, as if this is a reporter coming in and discovering a problem with the petition. It's the very definition of what could be called like a manufactured or fake news story. The reporter himself created the controversy, reported on it as if it was an external controversy, and did so in a way that also completely ignored that we started immediately taking measures to flag and delete all of these hoax petition signatures within hours of him even announcing this. So I think his fake signature that he put up there that he was boasting everywhere about was
Mhm.
maybe on the petition for a grand total of an hour and a half or an hour and 45 minutes before we caught it, flagged it, deleted it, blocked his IP address, do all the necessary measures to stop that. And it's been a continuous effort since then to keep the hoaxes off of the petition, but it's something that we are succeeding at, that we're very conscientiously trying to stop.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear that, and I think it's yet just another example of the amount of time, the amount of manpower put into dealing with, this bullshit is
Yes,
taken away from actually having a conversation about, okay, what can we do to open up and to do it safely, and what are the things that people should know about, going into this. I'm in New York. The listeners to the podcast will know that my wife and I, we had a baby during the height of COVID, March 26th. It was a really scary
right,
time, so
right,
scary, and I was just looking for. I just wanted to know, what do I have to do to stay alive?
exactly.
What do I have to do to keep my family alive? And it was so it was just so good to talk with experts who were honest, were truthful, we're going by using their expertise to say, look, um, wash your hands. It's really important that you wash your hands. This is the first time in my life that I think I've ever actually properly washed my hands before.
Right, you're starting to
I
carry
have to
the
say, yeah,
hand
the person
sanitizers and yeah.
the first 38 years of my life, I was really half-assing my hand washing, but also how to know what the risks are and know what is the most risky behavior. And I think, well, like, for example, one of the things that you talk about, or that is talked about in the declaration, is, hey, if you're going to meet older family members, it's better to do it outside
Yeah,
rather than inside. And it's like, here's a small thing that you can do that can greatly impact those who you care about, and that are who are around you. And as we've learned more and more about this disease, and I think especially looking at um, the way that Donald Trump had it,
sure.
and then beat it, and then Chris Christie as well had it and beat it. I want to know, like, okay, well, what did they take, and how can we make it so that is available to anybody who needs it? How can we
That's
get there,
exactly.
rather than let me see how many times I could have Mickey Mouse sign the Great Barrington Declaration.
Right, right, yeah. So it's a complete collapse of public discourse coming from the other side. And it's 100% one-sided in the way that they're engaged in a social media troll battle. And this is everything from supposedly top epidemiologists at Harvard and Yale that are tweeting profanities at us, that are tweeting and boasting about how the fact that they submitted hoax signatures, and we're trying to have a scientific discussion. A point that I keep bringing up and making is part of the problem with the lockdown strategy that we adopted back in the spring is it was geared toward the general population. It was geared to 100% of the public needed to lock down and shelter in place to stop this thing. But one of the unseen effects of that is we actually neglected for several months the concentrated outbreaks that were happening in places like nursing homes and long-term care facilities.
Right.
So it turns out to be just to be a horrendous disease that runs rampant and almost unchecked through our nursing homes. Meanwhile, we have these ineffectual lockdowns in place. So part of the declaration, we call it focused protection, and that is to have a strategy that intervenes on behalf of the most vulnerable, the nursing homes, the long-term care facilities. So maybe we adopt a measure that subsidizes nursing home workers to live on site, so they don't have to interact with the general public as much and risk entering into the facility with the virus when it just runs rampant. That's something that needed to be discussed back in March, and we had evidence to discuss it back in March, but it was shoved aside and squeezed out of the conversation because everyone was so focused on lockdowns.
Yeah.
And yet now we have the epidemiologists that are supposedly engaged in science are refusing to actually have a scientific conversation because they'd rather Twitter troll.
And one of the things that I'm so thankful about is I think the weekend right before my birthday, my father took ill and was in a hospital, and thankfully he was able to be treated. And he had a neurologist who said, "I'd much rather you not be here in this hospital with this new disease, this novel coronavirus going around. I'd much rather you be at home." My mind, I catastrophize a lot, so I would think the worst. But it was like wow, that was. I was my family, I think, but we were so fortunate to have someone who's like, okay, we're going to assess the risks here, and it's much better for you to be at home than it is to be in the hospital for another week, getting treatment for the diagnosis that he had. Phil, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I always just see it as such a great thing when I can talk with somebody who's going to show me stuff about my country, my history that I have no idea, while at the same time dealing with the same BS that I deal with, like online. You're on Facebook, you're on Twitter, you're dealing with that, but while at the same time, educating people. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it. Thanks again for having me on.